What is up, YouTube? I am Reckless, and today we're going to be talking about gun sights, and more specifically the ones that people consider to be cheap. Basically the ones where if people kill you with them, you automatically think, oh, if he wasn't using that sight, I would have survived. We're going to maybe talk a little bit about the pros and cons of it, and really discuss whether these sights are actually cheap, or whether it's just people's perception of them, and it's like, you know, one of those things where if everyone says that it's cheap, you're automatically going to start saying that it's cheap, etc. So before Black Ops 2, there was really only the thermal sight, and then that basically lit everyone up in white, except in the original Black Ops, it highlighted it was still white, but it was weird in Black Ops. It was really weird, but then in Black Ops 2, they introduced two new sights, as well as making a change to the thermal, or they actually called it the dual band in Black Ops 2, but they added in two sights because it was the first futuristic game. They added in these two sights to, you know, kind of fit what we think technology might be like in the future. And the first one that we're seeing right now in the gameplay is the millimeter scanner, and this one, I don't remember the exact specs on it, but what it does is whenever it sweeps, like if I aim in and whatnot, and you just kind of hold it there, it'll do a sweep, and it'll check behind things, and if there's someone standing still, that was the catch, they had to be standing still, so it was basically an anti-camper tool. If they were standing still and they were close enough to the wall, it could only see a couple of meters through the wall, and before it couldn't see anymore. But you could see his outline right there, kind of. But so it introduced that, and the thing that boggled my mind was that people didn't think that this was cheap, but they thought that the next sight that I'm going to talk about is cheap. But we'll get to that in just a second. So they introduced this sight, and it really, I don't know, it really wasn't used too much. It was used a little bit in Search and Destroy, and even in competitive Search and Destroy, it wasn't used that often. But yeah, it just wasn't used that much. And I guess, as you can see, the way I play with it through this gameplay right here, I guess it doesn't really work with the rushing style, because if you're rushing and you just aim down sights a little bit every here and there, like, you actually have to wait for it to make the sweeping motion. So yeah, I'm not even waiting for it to make the whole sweeping motion before I stop. So I guess that's one of the reasons why it wasn't chosen that often. Next up, we have the Target Finder sight. The Target Finder sight was basically the second new sight they introduced into Black Ops 2, and as you can see right here, what it basically did was it put a diamond around anyone not wearing Cold-Blooded. And I forgot to mention that, but the millimeter scanner and the Target Finder were both negated by the Cold-Blooded perk. It would make it to where the millimeter scanner couldn't see you through walls, and the Target Finder wouldn't put a diamond around you. But this was instantly regarded as the most cheap thing in the entire game, which I don't necessarily agree with. I rarely found it to be a problem. The only time I literally ever found it to be a problem was whenever people were camping behind their an assault shield and had it stuck into the ground, and they were just peeking over it camping. Yeah, that kind of got old, but honestly, you don't really need a target finder to be cheap with that at all. I don't know. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself as to talking about why some of these things are cheap and why I don't think they are. But as you can see here, if you're actually rushing and using the rushing playstyle, again, I would be seeing these people anyway. I mean, I guess it's kind of a quote-unquote noob-friendly tool, but for me, the diamonds that are around people are just distracting, and they actually throw my aim off. So once again, I don't find this sight to be a huge problem. And honestly, people who used it against me, I didn't really find to be a huge problem, because I could usually easily dislodge them with some kind of score streak, or avoid them at least. I mean, come on, just don't go back there if you know someone's using it. But the thing that just boggled my mind was people thought that this sight was way more cheap. Like, no one ever complained about the millimeter scanner, but this sight, oh goodness. I mean, it was just, I think it was just people, so many people would just keep repeating that this was a cheap sight, that they would, that it just became known in the community that if you use this site, you were being cheap. That brings us to the last site that I'm going to talk about, from Black Ops 2 anyway, and that brings us to the dual band scope. This was basically the exact same as the thermal scope from previous games, except it highlighted everyone in this bright orange color. But it took away your minimap, just like the target finder, which was another thing that blew my mind, was people thought the target finder was cheap and the millimeter scanner wasn't, even though the target finder took away your minimap and the millimeter scanner didn't. But anyway, this site also took away your minimap. And the thing that was only different about this site than the thermal sites in the games before it was, in the games before this, you could always have a thermal sight on your assault rifle, and in most games you could even put it on an SMG if you wanted. This game took that feature completely away, and you could only have the dual band scope on your sniper rifles, and then the millimeter scanner could only be put on assault rifles and SMGs. So and Cold-Blooded could also negate this scope, and yeah, that's about it for the Black Ops 2 scopes. So moving on to Ghosts, the current Call of Duty at this point, they brought back the traditional thermal sight, which we'll get to in a minute, and they brought in a new sight, and it's called the Tracker sight. And I would compare it to the target finder from Black Ops 2, although instead of drawing diamonds around the people, it highlights them in this thin orange outline. It makes the rest of your screen blurry, but it does leave up your HUD, like your minimap, the score, things like that, which in previous games it completely blacked everything out. And I think, and I mean, this has the same reputation that the target finder has. Sorry, my mind's getting sidetracked because I'm talking about so many different sites, but the Tracker site has the same reputation that the target finder site had, and that is that it's a cheap site and that only noobs use it, things like that, which, I mean, to be honest, I never use it either, but to me, I just find it to be more of a hindrance, just like I do the target finder and stuff like that. But I guess if people are sitting back and camping with it, then yeah, it can be kind of a nuisance. But what I don't understand, I literally don't understand this, is why people find this site to be more cheap and you know, a noob tool than the thermal site. And that's my argument for this entire commentary is, why does this site, especially since in this game, this site can be put on the exact same guns that the thermal sight can, except for sniper rifles. You can't put this on sniper rifles, but also you can flip this down to iron sights, as well as the thermal sight. Actually, the thermal sight actually switches over to a red dot sight, unless it's on sniper rifles. On sniper rifles, it's a fixed scope. But that's what I don't understand, is why this sight is considered to be more cheap than the thermal sight. So now, if we switch over to some thermal sight gameplay, we'll see how this, I don't know, like I said, I don't understand it. This sight, in my opinion, is just, well, I mean, I actually don't consider any of the sights cheap, but like I said, most people do. So as you can see right here, Incog, the perk Incog will make it not work the way it's supposed to, and that goes same with the Tracker sight as well. But this sight even gives you additional range than the Tracker sight, but it highlights them in this bright white, which in my opinion is much easier to see than just an orange glow outline around someone, because that glow can be pretty easily missed, but it's pretty hard to miss this big giant white. I mean, it makes their whole body white. I guess an argument can be made that this makes the everything else black and white unless you're looking at someone, which kind of makes it more difficult. But I don't know, the field of view is bigger on this. It's easier to spot targets, and like I said, if you go back to the beginning, you can flip it over to a red dot sight. The Tracker sight flips down into these ugly iron sights that I personally just can't stand. But yeah, it's just, personally, I don't think, I mean, if you rush, I think all of them are more of a hindrance than than a help. But even if, like, especially in search and destroy, or if you're playing competitively at all in any aspect, I think the thermal sight is much more helpful. And they've even gone so far as to completely remove it from the available options if you're playing competitively. If you're playing in clan versus clan or game battles, and even up to the MLG level, the tracker sight is completely banned, but the thermal sight is completely fine, even though it's 2 sights in one, and it also gives you a red dot. You can basically just remove the red dot and just play with this, and you'll have 2 sights in one. But I don't like to talk about these things without offering my opinion on why it is the way it is. So my final verdict is that the sights themselves aren't actually cheap. It's one of those things, as with so many other things, it's kind of been grandfathered into acceptance. It's been around for so long that we just accept it. But when new things come along that act differently, the tracker sight, the target finder, things like that, whenever those things come in to play, then it all of a sudden becomes cheap. It's not necessarily that it is actually cheap, it's just the fact that people want to have something to blame their deaths on. And like I said, confirmation bias makes you think that if you get killed by the tracker sight once or twice, or any other sight once or twice, then that's going to be in your mind the rest of the time you play the game, and it's going to be some way of blaming it on something other than something that is probably your own fault. But obviously, as with most of the things I talk about, this is just my opinion. I personally think I did better with the thermal sight than I did with any of the other sights in the gameplays. But let me know what you think. Do you feel the same way I do, or do you have valid reasons as to why you think the other sights are cheap? Let me know down in the comments, as well as leaving a rating. A like is always appreciated, but if not, as always, that's cool. This has been Reckless, guys. If you can't take it easy, don't take it at all. Peace.
Active.